I will now call upon the clerk of the court to read the first charge concerning comrades past, present and future from India.
I will be reading from the black and white charge sheet that each of you have received in your dossier, and it reads as following. Defendant 1, Unilever, jointly and severally with Defendant 2, the State of the Netherlands, is charged with committing crimes under Section 3 of the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act in the Koidal Canal region of Tamil Nadu in India by engaging in the following activities. It is alleged inter alia that 1, in 1983, Unilever set up a mercury thermometer manufacturing factory in Koidal Canal in Tamil Nadu in India after it was banned in the United States of America. Second charge is Unilever discharged levels of mercury in the Pambar Shola Wildlife Sanctuary that were 66 times higher than the levels permissible in the Netherlands and double the levels permissible in the UK. Third is that together these acts described in this first and second point amount to adoption of double standards in Unilever's operations in Tamil Nadu, India. 4. By 2001, the factory discharged an estimated 1.3 tons of mercury into the nearby Pambar Shola Wildlife Sanctuary. 5. The exposure to mercury caused death, disease, and injury to the factory workers and the residents of Koidal Canal, their children, grandchildren, and future generations. 6. The Sholakili and other birds, animals, plants, trees, rivers, hills, and other human and non-human species, as defined in the Act, lost their sanctuary in the Pambar Shola ecosystem. 7. In the name of restitution, Unilever cut down 425 trees on its factory land in 2020, which caused downstream flooding, and further discharge of 100 kilograms of mercury was washed into the ecosystem of the region, poisoning the food chain for humans, non-humans, as defined in sections 2.2 and 2.6 of the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. 8. Defendant 2, the State of the Netherlands, empowered Unilever to engage in the above crimes by recognizing Unilever as a corporate person. 9. The State of the Netherlands endowed Unilever with human rights and property rights, knowing that they were not natural persons. 10. The State of the Netherlands actively collaborated with the United Kingdom and other European and American states to establish legal entities such as the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, with the aims of empowering corporations like Unilever with the authority to commit crimes against humans and non-humans, past, present, and future, in the Koidal Canal region. 11. The State of the Netherlands benefited from the activities of Unilever in Koidal Canal and elsewhere by receiving revenues, taxes, takings, and direct and indirect benefits flowing from the destruction of ecologies and communities in the Koidal Canal region. 12. The State of the Netherlands actively promoted and recognized the freedoms of Unilever but took no steps whatsoever to recognize the self-determination and will of the people of Koidal Canal and the well-being of non-human species in the regions. These activities, if proved to be true, constitute intergenerational climate crimes against past, present, and future generations of humans, non-humans, cultures, and ecosystems in the Koidal Canal regions of Tamil Nadu, India, under Section 3A, B, C, and D of the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act.
I will now call upon the witnesses to substantiate the charges and to give evidence, present evidence to this court. I will call upon Nityanand Jayaraman of the organization Vettiver Koottamaippu in India. On request of the witness, we will first review a 10-minute evidentiary video before Jayaraman addresses this court directly. Thank you.
Come monsoon, magic abounds in the highlands of the Western Ghats. Parched earth meets a moisture-laden sky to thunderous applause. As life-giving water quenches the earth, the runoff emerges as rivulets and streams, filling ponds and tanks and finally feeding mighty rivers. All of South India's major rivers, Kaveri, Vaigai, Periyar and Tamirai Bharani, are born in the grasslands and shola forests of these highlands. Sholas are evergreen habitats with dense canopy, damp forest floor, and rich biodiversity. Pambar Shola, which descends from the popular hill town of Kodaikanal, has in its own way contributed to the birth of the ancient Tamil civilization. The Pambar, Snake River, that drops from these forests feeds the Vaigai River, the lifeline of the Sangam era civilization. The leaf litter and damp earth of the Shola forest are crawling with all kinds of life. The sweet-voiced Sholakili is an ardent singer and quite unfazed by human company. Don't let its sweet voice and small size fool you. The Sholakili is quite the local bully. It hunts down prey much larger than it, like the young ones of the shield-tailed snake. The water's edges, and the damp earth are a bustle of activity. Butterflies, damselflies, and dragonflies dart from one puddle to another in these wetlands. The clear waters of the Pambar stream offer good habitat for resplendent damselflies. The arrival of the female initiates a beautiful courtship ritual that plays out as a dance hovering over the gentle flowing water. In another location in the forest, a blue-bearded bee-eater feeds its chicks. A hole excavated on the mud bank of a Shola stream is its nest. These masters of the sky hunt damsel and dragonflies and cicadas to feed themselves and the chick. But what if the food itself is poisoned? For 4 decades, Pambar Shola has remained a silent victim to a deadly toxic insult. In 1983, a mercury thermometer factory that was shut down in America was brought to Kodaikanal by Ponds India Limited, now Hindustan Unilever. Ecologically, the factory site is part of the Pambar Shola. Where the factory ends, the wildlife sanctuary begins. In 2001, the factory was shut down for illegal and unsafe disposal of toxic mercury waste after former factory workers, irate townspeople, and environmentalists marched to the factory gates, outraged by the multinational's reckless behavior. The company estimates that more than 1.3 tons of mercury was discharged into the Pambar Shola. To put that in perspective, just 1 gram of mercury, about the average amount in a fever thermometer, deposited atmospherically over a 20-acre water body every year is sufficient to make fish in the lake too toxic for consumption. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin. It builds up rapidly along the food chain. Top predators like human beings who sit atop the food chain end up receiving deadly doses of this toxin. Mercury-exposed Unilever workers and their children suffered from kidney failure, dental, neurological disorders, and brain damage. After 15 years of delay and denial, 593 workers won a massive settlement from Unilever for deaths and disease caused by mercury. That was only half the battle won. The factory grounds are still heavily contaminated, with some places showing 50,000 times higher mercury than background levels. With every rain, this mercury gets washed out along with the soil into the Pambar Shola. Sediment samples taken from inside Pambar Shola have shown alarming levels of mercury. Mercury bioaccumulates and biomagnifies in the environment. Bioaccumulation occurs when an organism ingests mercury at a rate faster than it can excrete. Over time, the amount of residual mercury in that individual keeps growing. Biomagnification occurs when the concentration of the mercury increases as one moves up the food chain from prey to predator. Mercury in the soil and water affects every organism that lives in or off these media: cicadas, sholakili, damselfly, and the blue-bearded bee-eater. The sweet-throated sholakili lives off the soil. Unsuspecting sholakilis forage the mercury-tainted factory grounds for earthworms and cicadas. Cicada nymphs emerge to become cicadas after spending 2 and 17 years burrowed in the soil. If the soil is contaminated with mercury, the cicada stores up years' worth of poison in its body. The sholakili, which may consume a dozen cicadas in a good day's hunting, will accumulate unhealthy levels of mercury over a period. The shola system is replete with deadly food chains like this one. Dragonflies and damselflies depend entirely on clean water, not just for insect prey, but also to lay eggs and live out their early stages underwater. Their larvae are among the top predators of the river ecosystem, feeding on other insect larvae, tadpoles, and even small fish. But in the jungle, the predator too becomes prey. In December 2020, Unilever began remediation of its contaminated site even before getting all legal approvals. As part of what it calls a cleanup, Unilever clear-felled all trees from 4 acres of its site in January 2020. Now the contaminated soils are exposed to winds and intense rains of the highlands. Without the vegetative cover to hold the soil together, the rains now wash out even more soil-bound mercury than before. From its first act of shutting down its factory in America and relocating it to Kodaikanal to the task of fixing cleanup standards, Unilever has applied double standards to India. Its cleanup ambition is so low that even after the so-called remediation, there would be 20 times more mercury in the soil than would be permitted for human residential use in the UK, or 66 times more than would be permitted in the Netherlands. Unilever is headquartered in these two countries. But what's safe for humans may be deadly for other life forms. Let's not forget that the Pamba shola has life forms that are far more sensitive than human beings. Even after cleanup, the factory site will endanger sholakilis and bee-eaters that unsuspectingly hunt and feed their chicks with mercury-loaded insects. Unilever claims that the mercury contamination is contained within its property, but studies indicate that its effects are felt far beyond the hills down in the Vaigai plains. Fish samples taken from a pond in the plains, fed by the Pambar, had levels of mercury that would make it too dangerous for consumption by pregnant women. Not just pregnant women, Unilever's poisons are harming future generations by tainting mother bee eaters and sholakilis and their young. Unilever, a multi-billion-dollar multinational that pretends to care for the environment, cannot be allowed to cut corners and hurt voiceless victims, including birds, animals, and unborn generations. This film is dedicated to the sholakili, the bee-eater, and the future generations of all life forms, including humans.
Good afternoon and greetings to the honorable members of the jury and the public jury. I'm deeply saddened to be deposing in front of you more than 2 decades after the problem of Unilever's mercury pollution first surfaced, and more than 4 decades after the problem began. I am a Chennai-based journalist and a social activist. I'm 53 years old and have spent 21 years of my life fighting to hold Unilever accountable for the harm it has caused to people and the environment in Kodaikanal. In November 2000, My friend Navroz Modi, who lived in a beautiful wooded area opposite Unilever's mercury factory in Kodaikanal, called me. He had visited a local scrap merchant in a crowded working class section of Kodaikanal to see if he could find a window frame. I don't recall if he found the window frame. What he did find was a mound of broken thermometers dumped against the wall and tiny puddles of mercury scattered here and there. Navroz called me to find out if I would come and investigate. In December 2000, accompanied by my photographer friend Shailendra Yashwant, I documented Unilever's mercury dumps in the city. The factory is located atop a ridge. On its southern slope, the factory shares a fence line with the Pambar Shola Reserve Forest, now part of the Kodaikanal Wildlife Sanctuary. We found that Unilever had dumped mercury waste not just in the scrapyard, but also in the forest behind its factory, right on the slopes draining into the pristine Pambar catchment. We documented this, and on March 7, 2001, the townspeople of Kodaikanal confronted them with this evidence and demanded that the polluting multinational's factory be shut down. In a rare, never to be repeated display of integrity, the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board promptly shut the factory down. We celebrated what we thought was a victory. Little did we realize that more than a generation later, we would still be fighting for justice and to retain some degree of control over our elected government. Unilever talks up a big talk about corporate responsibility and green capitalism. But let that not fool you. Corporations cannot be responsible, and capitalism cannot be green. Unilever is no different from Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, Shell, or Exxon, or BP, or others like them. Their businesses have exploited and continue to exploit humans and the environment. This is pushing us to the brink of ecological collapse, aggravating social inequity and deprivation, and robbing future generations of people and other life forms of their right to enjoy this beautiful, bountiful earth. Much water has flown beneath the bridge. In March 2016, after 15 years of delay and denial, Unilever was forced to settle with workers who had been harmed due to workplace exposure to mercury. 15 years of campaigning made no difference. Between Unilever's impressive advertising budget and the fact that Unilever's victims came from marginalized communities has meant that the mainstream media, governments, and courts have been absent from the campaign for justice. In July 2015, we decided to bypass the corporate controlled mainstream media and the crony capitalists in the government and took to social media. Justice Rocks, an anti corporate arts collaborative that is an initiative of the collective that I'm part of, worked with a young songwriter and rapper. Sophia Ashraf's rap song, Kodaikanal Won't, went viral. Within days, Unilever was scrambling to find some corporate responsibility to put on display. After 7 months of campaigning and hectic legal work by pro bono lawyers, the multinational conceded a settlement. This, while welcome, is no victory. Unilever refused to admit guilt. No precedents were set. And then there is the issue of environmental contamination. Those of you who have seen the film may have noticed that in January 2020, Unilever clear felled 425 trees and removed all vegetation from the most contaminated sections of the factory site. The trees and the vegetation provided 3 layers of protection to the toxic soil. The monsoon rains in the highlands can be quite intense. The canopy of trees breaks the intensity of the falling rain. The shrubs and bushes beneath the trees offer a second level of protection, and the dense carpet of leaf litter a third. Even with all these protections, we were worried that soil bound mercury was washing out along with the rainwater. Numerous studies had pointed out that this was indeed happening. In August, we carried out a mathematical modeling of runoff of rainwater and soil mercury before and after clear felling. We found that even with the protective vegetative cover, the factory was leaking 5.25 kilograms of mercury into the sanctuary. This is a very large quantum. Just 1 gram of mercury deposited every year over a 20-acre lake can render all the fish in the lake unfit for human consumption. With the protective cover gone, after the trees had been felled, the quantum of mercury washing out into the Pambar stream may have increased drastically, up to 66 kilograms a year. Since January 2020, 100 kilogram of mercury may have already been cleaned out of the site into the aquatic environment, if the company's conservative estimate of contamination is to be believed. Unilever is legally required to take weekly samples of soil and sediment from leaving the factory site. Between the time they cut the trees and now, they would have had to have taken at least 1,000 samples of soil and water. They have not taken one. The state regulatory agency has historically danced to Unilever's tune. They continue to do the dance. From the time they moved a polluting factory from the US to India, to how they are handling the soil remediation of their polluted factory site now, Unilever and its predecessors have practiced environmental double standards. Contrary to its claim that it applies global standards everywhere, Unilever chooses to cut corners in jurisdictions with pliant regulators. In August 2000, in August 2020, Unilever's consultant submitted a supposedly scientific study about off-site contamination. The study concluded that all samples of water, soil, sediment, and vegetative matter had insignificant levels of mercury. We looked at the results of analysis. We had real scientists look at them as well. It turns out that the conclusion is not supported by the numbers they report as results. I'll give you just 2 examples and conclude my case. First, they report that no mercury was detected in water samples drawn from various parts of the sanctuary. They use this to conclude that all is well with the water. The level of detection, 0.003 milligram per liter, is 40 times higher than levels considered safe for aquatic life. Second, they report that soil mercury levels are insignificant inside the sanctuary. One soil sample taken from inside the wildlife sanctuary contained 4.6 milligrams per kilogram. That is, every kilogram of soil contained 4.6 milligrams of mercury. That number is 460 times higher than uncontaminated levels from the same sanctuary. The false sense of security nurtured by Unilever's baseless assurance that all is well with the Kodaikanal Wildlife Sanctuary will frustrate any mitigatory measures that can protect the shola and its wild residents. The yellow-bellied sholakili, the diminutive serenader, is a bird that is endemic to these hills. They have lived in these hills for at least 5 million years, as against the 2 million years of presence that the genus Homo has inhabited this planet. Unilever's reckless actions in Kodaikanal have already harmed several generations of the sholakili. Now its false assurances threaten future generations of this beautiful bird and many others like the sholakili. This is my submission to the jury to support my allegation on behalf of the sholakili and blue-bearded bee-eater that Unilever should be found guilty. I request you to ask the State of Netherlands to initiate an inquiry into our allegation of double standards and discrimination by Unilever against the people and wildlife of Kodaikanal. Thank you.
Thank you, Nityanand, for that evidence and for your very detailed presentation. May I now ask the judges, Sharon, Nicholas, Rasigan, do you have any questions for Nityanand? Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a question about the 2 issues that you said that should be considered, but would you consider a third issue, or have you already considered it? What would it cost to clean up the site to your satisfaction, and have you identified how that could be done? Because obviously what they did about the clear cutting is not not a good way to do that. So what needs to be done? And also I'm concerned about the long-term health effects on children and future generations of children and all the animals too, and everything that relates to that. Have you documented that also? I didn't hear all of the information that you've amassed, but those are two questions I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of cost of cleanup, we first need an estimate, an independent estimate of how much contamination there is in the factory premises and how much contamination has escaped from the factory premises. This would need to be done through direct field studies, but it would also have to be based on what is called a mercury mass balance. That is, how much mercury was imported into the factory site, how much of that can be accounted for in finished thermometers that were exported, how much of it can be accounted for in the broken thermometers that are on site, how much of it can be accounted for in terms of the illegal dumping that has happened over the years. And what remains is the unaccounted for mercury, which would be the amount that would either be distributed in the soil or discharged into the Pambar Shola. In 2001, Unilever commissioned a consultant called URS Dames and Moore and paid for a study. That study concluded that 500 and odd kilograms of mercury was unaccounted for after doing this mass balance and swearing to it that the mass balance was accurate and based on good, reliable figures. The workers looked at it and raised an issue. They pointed out that the company had forgotten to include a 10.8 ton, that is 10,800 kilogram consignment of mercury that it had purchased from Bombay, which means after the mass balance had been done and both the sides had reportedly been balanced, 10.8 tons of mercury remained to be accounted for. Unilever did not bat an eyelid. It recruited the same consultant to come back and work with the new figures. The numbers were juggled. The number of thermometers exported was increased by 100,000. The amount of mercury in each thermometer was increased by 0.5 grams. And nearly 9 tons of mercury was just accounted for through this juggling. So we have no real independent estimate of how much mercury lies buried in the factory site. We only have the companies say so. In the last 20 years, our consistent demand has been to the government to commission an independent study paid for by the government, with the money being recovered by the government from the polluter. Till date, there has not been a single sample that's been taken by an independent agency. As for whether we have estimates, we do not have the resources to conduct studies like this, nor do we have permission to enter the factory site or take samples from the wildlife sanctuary. So the possibility for civil society, especially a small unfunded collective like ours, to undertake such studies is out of the question. This is the responsibility of the government that we elect, and this is the responsibility of the government to ensure that the polluter does the right thing. As far as the studies are concerned, I think I've answered. And clear cutting, again, we've asked for independent studies that look at the impact of clear cutting on the Pambar Shola and its wildlife. For this, studies can be done that measure the amount of soil and water leaving the factory site. These real field studies, very accurate, can be done, but for that, the government and the regulators have to have the political will. It is quite possible to also study what has been the impact already of the mercury discharge into the Pambar Shola. But again, that study would have to be carried out by an independent agency. As I've already pointed out, not everything that comes out from scientists is science, because science requires both science and integrity. And oftentimes the latter is scarce. Thank you.
Is there any? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nityanand. As you speak about what capacity and capability is available for local groups to respond to the actions of transnational corporations, working with governments as well, there is a huge unevenness that you've shared with us, both in terms of responsibility, but also capacity and capability to fulfill obligations. So having learned from this, and again, with the establishment of firms that work with dangerous chemicals or any material that's dangerous, these are things that we learn about over time as well. So how, from the experience in your territory itself, can we gain lessons for the future? How can similar activities be prevented rather than us just seeking to remediate what's already taken place? I mean, are there opinions from the community about how we stop this happening elsewhere?
Thank you very much. That is a question that goes well beyond just the issue of one corporation polluting, because I have also been associated with the campaign for justice in Bhopal, unfortunately for nearly 25 years. And again, over there, we have an errant corporation, a collusive government, and a huge legacy site. For a country like India, which has suffered the world's worst industrial disaster, to have a repeat with an extremely reputed and an extremely respected, and Unilever comes across as the Mother Teresa of all corporations. To have that being repeated and to have the same story being continued, suggests that we cannot deal with this from a corporation to corporation basis. If we do not read the writing on the wall, that corporations, in the manner that they are structured now, cannot be part of a sustainable future. Governments, in the manner that they are structured now, cannot be part of a sustainable future. An economy that is built on exploiting human and environment cannot be part of a sustainable future. An economy that is based on externalities, externalizing to communities that are either invisible or to future generations that don't have a voice, cannot be sustainable. And this is extremely important at this point in time when we are just gearing up for one of the world's largest circuses in Glasgow, where people are talking about net zero, they're talking about financial mechanisms, but nobody's addressing the elephant in the room. How can we have a sustainable future under capitalism with growth and colonialism as its model?
Thank you very much.
One last question from me, and that is, you concluded your presentation by saying that the state of Netherlands should initiate an inquiry and should do something about this. Why do you think that the state of Netherlands is responsible for this, and to what extent does their responsibility extend according to you? Are you suggesting that they should get involved in actually estimating the costs of remediation of the Kodaikanal region? Thank you.
I think about 2 decades ago, there was an effort to develop legally binding norms on transnational corporations. And this was again based on our experiences with what happened in Nigeria, what happened in Bhopal, and numerous other places around the world, where corporate criminals committed crimes against humanity and were able to escape scot-free. The United Nations, the governments of the world, and the multinational corporations sat together and defeated these transnational norms and brought out something called the UN Global Compact, which is essentially the UN speak for greenwash. We have no way to hold corporations accountable. The reason why we're reaching out to the Netherlands is because the Netherlands is party to the building up of the image of Unilever as a responsible corporation. The Netherlands is party to the problems in Kodaikanal by remaining silent. I would not speak for my state. I would not speak for the state of India and for the state of Tamil Nadu, because they have clearly demonstrated that they are not up to the task of addressing issues of justice within their boundaries, especially if that only affects the poor and the unborn generations and the environment. The only thing that we have received in this 20-year struggle is a settlement for the workers with Unilever. And this settlement was obtained not through the courts in India, not with the help of the government, not with the help of the government of Netherlands, but despite that. It was the magic of a viral rap song. Now, we can't be expected to generate a rap song for every corporate crime. Here, what we're expecting is that the Netherlands also talks up a big talk about being responsive to its people, responsive to issues of justice. Then I think the Netherlands should stand up and walk its talk. And it can do that by ensuring that what it calls its corporate citizen, the company that it earns a lot of revenue from because of its headquarters in Rotterdam, is this company behaving responsibly? I think at the very least, the state of Netherlands can initiate a basic study to look at due diligence and not just look at what the Indian courts and the Indian state have to say, but what do the people have to say? What has remained unsaid? If it has in it to do an impartial and an open inquiry, I think we would be able to at least right some of the wrongs that have already happened, if not on the ground, at least for history.
Thank you for that. I will, okay, one quick one.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question, pick up particularly on your statement that corporations as structured today cannot be part of a sustainable future. So I'd like to just explore something about the corporate structure of Unilever, and whether you could comment on whether that corporate structure has been employed in order to be able to evade responsibilities in any one place where, in this case, pollution happens. I'd particularly like you to, if you have the information, to tell the court whether Unilever has ever claimed that its head office in the Netherlands, as it then was, now in London, has no control over Unilever in Hindustan, and whether, to your knowledge, that sort of statement is confounded by actual direction from headquarters to subsidiaries, and, for example, through the promulgation of group-wide policies. So now what I'd like to get at is how corporate structure today might enable companies to evade responsibilities all over the world.
To answer your question about whether Unilever headquarters has ever claimed that it has no control over, repeatedly. Since 2011 or 2013, there have been shareholders from United Kingdom who have raised questions in the annual shareholders meeting. And the CEO at that time, Mr. Paul Polman, in the first meeting said he was not fully briefed about it and he would educate himself and respond. And in the second meeting, he said that as far as we know, we are not responsible. Hindustan Unilever is the one that is in charge of what all things that happen, despite the fact that Unilever has a controlling stake. It has 51%, at least at the time, I don't know what it is now, of the shares. Now, control is exercised not merely through the number of shares you have. That's a very, very legalistic way of looking at something as complex as this. Do you have an obligation going beyond what your legal is? Because that is what you claim. If you claim you have a responsibility to the future, the laws for the future haven't been written yet. You're doing it from a moral obligation. If you're claiming that your corporation is more than just a legal artifact, that it can behave responsibly, that it can express compassion, that it can think about the forest and the living beings, which is what Unilever's website does, then any argument that suggests that we will strictly look at the legal control, in this case, even that is not made out, I think does not stand. I'm sorry, I forgot your last question, if you can repeat it. Or if I've
I think
covered
that actually sort of does it. I was asking particularly whether Unilever had group-wide standards, and by establishing group-wide standards, had in fact recognised that the central headquarters is in control of establishing the norms by which this company is supposed to act.
Well, I mean, I think that the way it played out, it was very clear that they are in control, because I think that the Unilever headquarters got into a tiz, because it might be that Unilever headquarters only has this much control, but when one brand takes a beating, everybody stands up. And I think that was the response that was seen at the time, because I think the CEO was out on vacation for the weekend, and when he came out of the vacation, the issue had gone viral, and he responded for the first time responsibly. So in 15 years, they managed to find the responsibility with a rap song. And I think that there, again, they made it very clear that it is possible, if they wish to. This thing could have been done in 2001. Why wait for 15 years to do what you call is a humanitarian gesture?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I will now ask the members of the jury if they have any questions to ask Nityanand. Is there any questions that you want to ask him? Anyone? Any questions to put to him? Yeah.
Thank you for your contribution. I have a question about the Bhopal case and this one, because I think in Bhopal there has been compensation paid to victims, and has that happened in this case?
In the Bhopal case, what was paid was not compensation. It is what we call a pittance. What was demanded was $3 billion, and the government of India negotiated it down and brought it to $470 million. That amount was distributed to the people of Bhopal as compensation. That worked up to a paltry sum of 25,000 rupees per person who was affected. 25,000 rupees will work up to about $300 as per today's dollar rates. $300 for lifelong injury. That's a compensation that is given, and this was a great legal settlement presided over by the Supreme Court of India. As part of the settlement, the Supreme Court also said that the criminal cases against Unilever, against Union Carbide, would be written off. Fortunately, because of very intense campaigning by local people, the criminal cases were reinstated. In the case of Unilever, none of this has happened. In 2004, a Supreme Court monitoring committee came in and ordered that 50 crores, nearly 5 million rupees, was to be given to the Pollution Control Board so that that money could be spent for cleanup, and also that the workers would have to be compensated. None of that happened. No money was given to the Pollution Control Board. And the Pollution Control Board and the Unilever sat in the same room and tried to decide what should be the standards. So, no, there's not been any compensation given. What happened with the workers is what the Unilever calls a no guilt settlement. So, no compensation has been given. Environmental violations are offenses under the Indian law. And Unilever is guilty of multiple offenses in terms of its violation of the hazardous waste authorization, in terms of violations of the Water Act and the Air Act. And for these violations, it ought to be facing multiple charges in a criminal court. In the last 21 years, not a single case has been filed by the Pollution Control Board or the state.
Thank you. Any other further question? Yeah? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your contribution. I was wondering if there's any knowledge about if it's even technically possible to clean up the lead runoffs. Yeah, that's my question.
I'm not a very technically proficient person in terms of whether it's possible to clean up. If there are hotspots, I would imagine it would be possible to remove. There is really no cleaning up because it will have to go somewhere. But one would be able to remove it from a sensitive place and move it to a less sensitive place, with the hope that the less sensitive place is not defined as a place where poor people live. But for that to happen, first there needs to be a comprehensive study of what is where inside the wildlife sanctuary. My understanding and my imagination, my understanding and thinking on this matter is that this mercury has been lost to the environment and is probably not going to be recoverable. It will build up in the food chain and cause damage. The best that we can hope to do at this point is to identify hotspots and clean it up and monitor the rest of the biota for any kind of a built up and early warnings to see if there's anything that we can do to help. I mean, given that we've already taken on the job of playing God, we might as well try and do it well.
Any other question? Are there any further questions? Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for the information. I was wondering what kind of legal, how was it legally enabled, the Dutch government, to open the plant in the first place in India when it was rejected in America? I'm unsure how that happened. If it was deemed unsafe and unfit for a different environment, how was it approved for this particular place?
Thank you. The factory in a place called Watertown in New York. This is on the banks of a river, Black River, which emptied into Lake Ontario. And in the 1970s and early 80s, there was a clampdown on the discharge of persistent poisons. That's poisons that don't disappear and poisons that bioaccumulate in the environment. This clampdown was a result of finding high and dangerous levels of chemicals like mercury in fish and in human and in seals and walruses and polar bears. And so the governments of Canada and the US decided to clamp down on any sources of pollution. This made it extremely difficult to comply with the regulation without having to spend a lot of money. So the factory was shut down following the economic logic of tightening pollution legislation and moved to a less a more kind of a laxer mm, legal regime, which is India. And when it came to Kodaikanal, the company did not really reveal its full and true nature. It claimed that it was a glass manufacturing facility and set itself up inside a residential area and abutting a wildlife sanctuary. At that time, it was a reserve forest. If people had known, if they had declared that they have kind of been squeezed out of the American jurisdiction, that they are here handling an extremely toxic metal, things may have been different, may have been different. In fact, because they did not disclose this, we had situation inside the factory where workers would play with mercury, where they would take it in their hands and throw it at each other because mercury was cool to feel. It looked really nice and shiny and looked like a plaything. So I think that a lot of damage has been done by the manner in which they withheld information.
Thank you for that, Nityanand. I have one very short question. Are you aware of other thermometer factories in other countries that are still operating? That was one. And secondly, the thermometers that were manufactured in Kodaikanal, were they mainly for Indian markets, South Asian markets, or global markets?
So the factory was moved from United States and set up in India under something called the 100% export-oriented unit scheme, which means the company moved a polluting factory into India, availing Government of India concessions. The factory's production was almost 100% for export markets in Spain, in the United States, and other places. What the factory imported: mercury, imported glass, exported the thermometers, and left behind the waste.
Thank you.
As far as other thermometer factories in other parts of the country, I don't have a clear answer. But right now, most thermometer factories, mercury thermometer factories, have been phased out and replaced by digital thermometers. I hope there aren't any still running in India or elsewhere.